I must say, it is a great year to be a member of the Notre Dame History Department. Not only do we have Kathy's book, but our next book in the Seminar of American Religion, there's a advertisement at your seat here, is Darren Dochuk. Darren, raise your hand. He's here. There he is. Anointed with Oil, How Christianity and Crude Made Modern America, published by Basic just this June. And the commentators are Melanie McAllister and Andrew Preston, set for Saturday, April 18th, 2020, in this place. So we'll look forward to that very much. Okay, the floor is open for questions. You can ask questions of Kathy, Christine, or Kevin, and I'll try and help identify people and moderate, but look forward to a lively discussion. Yes, and Peter, if you could just introduce yourself nice and loud so everybody knows who you are.
Peter Tucson, IUPUI. I'm interested in this issue of a national patron saint that comes up some in the book. And of course, in some ways it's implied by the title, a saint of our own. But you also end on the note that contrary to the expectations of the first U.S. saint-seekers, could never be represented by any single holy hero. The diversity of American Catholicism, in other words, militated against having a single representative hero. And so you point out earlier in the book that, though there is a national Saint Mary under the title of the Immaculate Conception, we don't have a single homegrown hero. It seems that Mother Seton came closer to this than anybody, but what intrigues me about her case is, of course, she was originally a Protestant and a convert to Catholicism, and so I wonder if that in and of itself could have militated against her broader representativeness as a national saint. So I guess my question is, was there ever a moment in American Catholic history where a single holy hero would have been possible? And do I read the book correctly that Mother Seton came as close to that as anybody?
That priest I mentioned at the Congregation for the Cause of the Saints who told me that I didn't have a book, it was actually a much more productive conversation than that story would indicate, because he also said, there's no national patron saint in the United States. And I hadn't realized that until he said, the only patron is Our Lady of the Immaculate Conception. And by the way, I love in Catholic circles to mention that there's no patron saint. And people say, but Our Lady of the Immaculate Conception. Very few people know that, but there are some who do. And I think that is fundamentally different. A title of Mary versus someone who actually walked on American soil. So anyway, once he clarified that for me, I did start thinking more and more about this question. And yeah, he did read the book right. I think that the candidates who were proposed as best suited to that in a particular age, by the time their canonization process finished, they weren't understood. And the most remarkable of that is Cabrini, who in the 1930s is our quintessential American, but in 1946, no, we need someone who is actually American. I think that was the most dramatic example of it. I think Seton did come closest, but I think people didn't care enough. It's not that hard to get someone declared a patron. Comparatively, it's a lot less harder than getting someone canonized. But you do have to have someone propose and say, at some point in the early 2000s, the Vatican was looking for a patron saint of the internet. And was soliciting proposals from just anybody. You didn't have to be Catholic. So they were all very interesting. And by the way, it's Saint Isidore, who apparently was a Spanish saint who sold the equivalent of encyclopedias in whatever century it was. So he's officially the patron saint of the internet. But anyway, it's not that hard to get that, but you have to actually make a case. And I think Seton, the irony in that story is, at the moment you finally have someone who's canonized, which is a prerequisite for being declared a patron, who could plausibly be said to have generated enough enthusiasm, it doesn't matter anymore. U.S. Catholics don't want one. I do think, I remember the moment during Pope Francis's visit when, and I stuck this in the final chapter, when President Obama presented Pope Francis with the key to Seton's home in Emmitsburg, Maryland. So she was, and I did try somewhat to find out who at the State Department picked her, but I didn't get very far in my inquiries. So that was, I think, a sense that, in terms of the already canonized Americans, she might come closest to being iconic. But she is not a patron. She's the patron saint of, I think, the state of Maryland. So it's interesting. So yeah, you read that exactly correctly. And I think, I wouldn't know if I had a chance to name a patron. I don't know if I could do that. I think it's not just the diversity of the American Catholic experience, it's the diversity of the American experience. And so I think this is an argument that the United States is not like Ireland or France, or it's modern, it's not a Catholic state, and I think that it would be difficult to find someone. But if anyone has any suggestions, I'm happy to pass them along. Wield my vast influence at the Congregation of the Cross of the Saints, which is none.
Tom Gesellman, Notre Dame.
Yeah, Tom Gesellman, University of Notre Dame, History Department. Kathy, I said last night, I just enjoyed the book so much over the last 2 days. I want to take up a point that Professor Heyrman raised that we talked about last night a little bit as well, which is the popular dimension. And maybe one way to get at that I think you would be able to say something about is the devotional life of the saint seekers themselves. Because it's hard to measure popular religiosity. Maybe you can count statues of St. Teresa versus Mother Seton or whatever, but in your reading of the correspondence of the saint seekers themselves, can you tell us more about how they related devotionally to the saints that they're promoting? Because the story you tell is primarily one of maneuvering and politicking. At times we get a sense that there's more there. What kinds of devotional relationships did they have, and did they change over time as we move from saint seekers in the 19th to the 20th century?
It's a great question. I think one thing I wish I had put more into the book is I read lots of letters from lay people who were reporting miracles or favors. Miracles are usually more dramatic. Favors are more like, I prayed my husband would get a job, and he got a job. I prayed to do well in this exam. And there's such a poignancy to that, and I think I could have definitely communicated some more of that. And so what is their devotional life? I think the consistent thing is that they feel the saints' presence. The saints are there with them. They're whatever whether it's a death, that they're experiencing an illness, that the saint is literally there, and whether that's communicated through a relic of the saint, a holy card, there's a knowledge that very much I feel this invocation. And even when the Vatican does certify a miracle, one of the keys is proximity of the invocation to the cure or the miracle, that and immediate ones are like the instant. I prayed that I would be healed, and I feel that. So I think that's a common sense. So yes, it's through tactile ways that you photograph statues, but more this sense people have that the ones to Seton, particularly because of her tragic life, really, the loss of 2 children before her death, the death of many, those of you who were here last semester for Catherine O'Donnell's biography, in which she chronicles the loss of that. So many parents of ill children wrote to her petitioners to talk about miracles they were hoping to receive, or mostly miracles they were hoping to receive, and that she knew what they were going through because she had been a parent. She'd been a mother in particular. So that's where that, and these are all, they're located in archives at the local level because they're all sent. And one of the disconnects I felt during this book was the whole concept of a failed miracle, a miracle that didn't get approval from the Vatican, but of course it's not a failed miracle to the people who experience it as a miracle. So the archives are full of those kinds of stories. Like I don't need the Vatican to declare her a saint. I know she's a saint because she affected this transformation in my life. But it would be really nice if the Vatican did acknowledge it. I don't need that, but it'd be really nice. So that's the tension. So yeah, I think there's a lot more to be said, a lot more I could have included in that. So thank you for asking that.
Malachy?
Oh, I'm not in charge. Sorry, I'm not calling the questions. It's very hard.
Malachy McCarthy with the Clusian Missionary Archives, which we founded the St. Jude devotion. But one of the things that I found in my research, which I think is unique to Chicago, is starting with the Little Flower, where 800,000 people attend the opening of the shrine on Woodlawn. And then you have St. Jude, which is pilgrimage by mail. And then you have the Our Lady of Sorrows devotion in 37, which is huge in Chicago because it's during a wartime thing. Two of those generate publications, The Voice of St. Jude, which is now U.S. Catholic, and Novena Notes, where they really shift from a devotionalism to actual social action. And this is very clear in The Voice of St. Jude that basically it starts as initially to say who the Claretians were, who St. Jude was, because no one knew who St. Jude was. And then it moves really into the 50s to become socially conscious and talks about discrimination and all this bit. So my question is this, does the promotion of each of these saints in the journals, does it affect any change or development? Because with the St. Jude devotion, we've created what we call a Claretian initiative. So we have to struggle with, because it's a by mail devotion and an internet devotion now, how do you shape contemporary culture to meet the needs of the poor so that you gain money? Because those three devotions were all money makers. I mean, the Little Flower was to build Mount Carmel High School. St. Jude was to really support the Mexican community that the Claretians ran. And I think that Our Lady of Sorrows was really to build the basilica. So they all had this monetary, which is different than what you're looking at, but they all had a monetary sideshow. And the people who ran them were like P.T. Barnum. They're very
the royal family of P.T. Barnum, I'm loving these.
But they're very unique individuals. But my question is really, does the written promotion really lead to some active practice of social justice or Catholicism?
Yeah, does it lead to it, or does it promote it? Does it reflect it? You know, I think that tracing the change over time in a particular devotional journal would be amazing. I mean, I got a glimpse of that thanks to Ellen Scarrett and others. I have access to a full run of the Mother Cabrini Messenger, which was also published out of Chicago, and it's really wonderful to just see how they were writing about that in the during World War II to how that changed in the 50s and 60s and still published today. So I think that would be, and yes, it does cost money, which is not supposed to. I mean, technically in canon law, you can't charge. It has to be a donation, but it's kind of like it's expected. So I would have loved to have followed the money more than I did. That was just not something I was able to do. But I think that was a lot of money, and I was able to get into some of that with the Redemptorist because I had access to their financial files that I didn't have for other congregations, just how much money was coming in on all of that. So, well, yes, but Kevin, please.
I was going to defend you better than you're defending yourself, I think.
Okay,
because you do talk about the complaints coming from some of the laity saying some of the millions of dollars that are spent trying to promote saints could be better used to feed the poor or clothe the needy. So that is a part, and I think an important part. Maybe you could have made more of it, I guess, but it's not like you ignored it completely. And it became a vocal component from the laity, as I understood it in your telling.
Well, I think that was more how much it costs to put a cause forward at the Vatican. And I think what Malachy's talking about is what it's bringing in the local community. Right. I think when you hear but the objections are, and there are sorts of, I've had people tell me, mostly people who are promoting causes, it's actually not that much money. One person said it's like throwing a big wedding. You want to have a big party, and it's also spread out over decades or centuries for that. But there is evidence. You find these traces in the correspondence of Spellman visited Rome and gave me a nice gift. He gave the postulator, a very sizable gift. What exactly was that? And the accounting was not as strict as I might have. But it does. It does cost a lot of money. Yeah.
But I think the issue, my point is that the fact that because of the devotion, and these are well-established devotions, the money that the devotion generates goes back to the poor. Mm-hmm. Like, for example, the Claretians built low-income housing. They have an agency of low-income housing they subsidize. They did a health center, and now we support the whole global outreach of the Claretian missions, around the world. So there is this whole idea that you find in Novena Notes and the Voice of St. Jude is that you take the devotion, the saint accompanies you, and then you move it on to social action. And you move it on to doing something good for other people. So it's not necessarily, because the Claretians have a lot of money, but they never talk about it. They started direct mail in 1937. Yeah. So you can imagine how much money that they have bankrolled. But that's never discussed. It always goes to and they work in the worst neighborhoods. Yeah. But I think that's the key. I'm just wondering about how it's translated, the devotion at post-canonization.
And when was the person canon, or when,
right.
As social justice became more more prominent in the American church? When is it?
I think it goes Janine and then June. I'm sorry, Mary Beth.
Mary Beth Connolly, Purdue Northwest. My question is kind of a little more speculative about Sister Blandina. I know when I was reading about Cabrini, I noted, well, jeepers, Sister Blandina did the same thing. And then you mentioned at the end about when you mentioned her and about her being the saint, the would-be saint that would lean in. And I was thinking about the cause, how it was opened, and where it was opened. And if you look at, I briefly looked at the internet and looked at her novena for her canonization, and everything that's mentioned about it in that novena is for labor, immigration, and so forth. Women are never really mentioned in this, and so my question is, could she be the saint for women in the church in the future? Could she be the or is she being put forward for a different purpose in the church, I guess?
I love that question. Thank you. And I did not get to talk to the Sisters of Charity who are promoting her cause. I would love to. They're the ones to ask, of course. So this is Sister Blandina Segale, who was a Sister of Charity and who coincidentally went on that pilgrimage in 1931 to petition the Vatican for Seton's cause for canonization. Now has an open cause. I did find an article, and Michael Skaggs helped me find it, The Saint Who Leaned In, which was published, I think, in maybe I have to check the footnotes, but I think it was 2014. And this is actually a great example of how fleeting this all can be, because I assigned that. I teach a first-year seminar called Sanctity in Society, and I assigned it to my first years last year. And I realized they weren't familiar with the term leaned in, right? I mean, Sheryl Sandberg's, when did that book come out? 2012 maybe? But they were 11. I mean, they did, so I just kind of thought they'd all, and they had never heard of leaned in. So that was just another, but I also love, I mean, that's kind of the argument that I make. People now gravitate to saints, aspects of saint stories that reveal more about how they position themselves within the church than how the church positions itself in America. And so could she be a patron saint for Catholic women who, want to bust out of predefined roles? Yes, she could. But the fact that you're even asking that question fits into this larger story about how do I see what the Catholic Church needs today.
The beginning part, when I was talking with Sister Judith when she was still the archivist, and there was a reticence for the same reason that's been articulated about the cost and the purpose, but it came from the Southwest, and this was something and they got on board though, and so now they're on board. But But I think from my research of her, I don't think the stories that you find in the Santa Maria journals are the ones that a contemporary party line would be what we want for Catholic womanhood.
Well, and that's an argument, too, that I've made to many Catholic sisters to persist. And yes, I mean, I was at the Congregation for the Cause of the Saints twice, and I wanted to bang my head against the wall every single time. I mean, it's really frustrating and maddening to do it. But who tells the story? Who gets to tell the story? And you have to be engaged in order to shape the story. And so by ceding the story to others, in the long run, you might be doing more damage. So, yeah, I think that's true. In Dorothy Day, a saint who there's many objections to. Is her story going to be tamed? Well, it's kind of up to the petitioners to not let that happen, and they have more control than they might think. And I think it's important to think about to not disengage from an institution, even though, and maybe especially when you feel powerless, is the time to work more with that. So it's a great example, and I hope she's...
Jim and then Ellen.
Jim Connolly, University of Portland Emeritus. In the book, a lot of attention is given to the long struggle in the 19th century and early 20th to come up with an American saint. But I wonder, I've heard it said that whenever the Vatican thought of Republican governments and Republican cultures, they immediately thought of the French Revolution and the Third Republic in France. Is it possible that there was a prejudice on the part of the Vatican officials that holiness could not be cultivated in a Republican culture, even though the United States had not gone the same way as France?
Absolutely. I think that was part of the motivation in sending that first petition from the Third Plenary Council. It is possible here to have had holiness. There has been holiness, and it was an argument about defending the United States to a group of people who didn't understand the United States very well, and even so, I loved when I found that letter proposing Tekakwitha and the two martyrs that was sent at the Third Plenary Council, because the Third Plenary Council is kind of like a really important thing in American Catholic history, this benchmark, and we talk about it in terms of the school question, all these other, but saints were there too. They were thinking that part of the way they could justify, the United States could justify its existence to stop being thought of as a mission territory and thought of as a viable, thriving national church. Not national church in a sense that organized as a national church under Vatican authority was to show that holiness had flourished not only in the 19th century but way back in the 17th century. Tekakwitha becomes the exemplar of that. So yeah, I think it was part of making a case that the American experiment was not antithetical to Catholic holiness. Absolutely.
Ellen, and then Bill.
Kathy, in your beautifully written book, early on, you noticed that Jane Addams was appalled by beatification in Rome in 1888. Well, she didn't have to worry, because within 10 years, mainline publications were calling her St. Jane. Later in the book, you raised something that really just caught my attention, that Sister Mary Ignatia Gavin, and that Alcoholics Anonymous wanted to promote her sainthood. And I'm thinking, oh yes, my God, and yet her community is not interested. And to me, this raises the question, what happens, are women really writing themselves out of their own history in not pursuing canonization, which, as you point out in the book, leads to naming schools, all kinds of ways of keeping charism and identity alive?
I think they are, and I've had several representatives of male congregations whose causes were introduced in the late 19th century and have kind of fallen by the wayside. A few Vincentians, and talk about that they are investing. They're investing in canonization now because as their numbers are dwindling, and they may actually be disappearing from the American landscape, to canonize one of their own is a way to ensure that it will be permanently on the American landscape. And that's not what the women are doing. And I understand why, but I think that is a consequence. And canonization is frustrating and tedious and long and expensive, but it is permanent. It does get you, and you hear a lot about that with the women like Dorothy Stang, like the women of El Salvador. Well, we know they're saints. They're saints to us. We've named things after them. And that's great. But everyone that remembers them is going to be dead. And then who's going to remember them then? So yeah, I do think it has consequences that, again, I didn't fully appreciate before I started writing this book.
Scott and then Bill.
I wanted to pick up on Jim Connolly's question and expand on it a little bit. Could you read the relationships between the Holy See and the American Church broadly, not only in that moment that Jim mentioned, but throughout? I mean, is this one way to get at that relationship? If you go through the various moments you point out, Kathy, in the book, and ask the question, how do we infer the Vatican's attitude through the canonization process and the frustrations of it for most of its period? For one thing, it's kind of bizarre that some of these saints are really not Americans, right? I mean, and there's almost the ones who would more qualify, born and died here. They're American. You have Tecovitha instead. You have Cabrini, etc. There's almost a weird and odd way that the Vatican, the Holy See, throughout all of the convoluted process, is making a statement about the U.S. in general. And we can talk about, the bumbling mission territory, they don't know what they're doing, they want to kind of respond. But also, if not fear, apprehension. I wonder if that plays in of American nationalism and American, in the internet, the universal church, the role of America, the United States. And, even Gibbons, when he's struggling in the beginning and he wants to promote Seton, and Gibbons is in this very fraught relationship with the Vatican about what does it mean to be American. So I can understand why he's frustrated on many levels, because there's a real abiding suspicion of the virtues, the American virtues you referred to, that could be virtues of American saints. The Vatican's not particularly applauding those virtues, or at least some in the Vatican, the Holy See at that time. I wonder and then you take it to these fascinating contemporary questions, and so can you track the different perceptions, not just of the American church, but how it's embedded politically in a nation that becomes threatening, a source of revenue, a source of inspiration. It's a complicated story. It's not your story, but it really opens up that question of how much that is in play.
Absolutely, that's a fascinating angle on how, and it could have been an organizing paradigm of the book. I mean, this came across really clear, I think, in John Newman's cause, which was another one that could have been the thread, the main organizing thread. But they have this Vatican officials talking about what does it matter that he was efficient, and he built a real estate empire. Like this has nothing to do with the virtues. The virtues as they're defined by.
Those are American virtues.
Yeah. And then this idea. I mean, with his, I spent I don't know how long, but following but not as long as they did. Trying to find evidence of his naturalization papers. They knew he had become a citizen, but they didn't have evidence of it. So they spent 4 decades writing to every place he had ever lived, trying to find evidence of his, which had no bearing on the cause whatsoever. And then when they find it, by the time they find it in 1963, it matters more that he was born in Bohemia and he was, born behind the Iron Curtain. It didn't even matter that he was born in America. So how he became the anti-communist saint, I think, I didn't do enough with there, and how Cicognani, the apostolic delegate, who's spent 25 years in the United States and then gets back to Rome. That's another irony. I mean, it was about, for so long it was, America doing it on its own, getting a saint on its own, but actually it was the presence of this Roman official, Roman person who had spent 25 years in America that actually was working behind the scenes. But he picks Newman over Seton because of anti-communism. He becomes Vatican Secretary of State, and so that becomes. So yes, I think that is a wonderful way to do it. And I think the challenge in this was managing the triangle, of Rome, U.S. Catholics, other Americans, and it's about the saints connected all of those relationships, all those links, and which one got more emphasis in any given period. It was hard to balance all that. But I think thinking about it as a triangle, Rome is always has to be in the picture, and what Rome thought was always there. And one of the ways they tried to figure that out was by getting Rome to agree that someone had actually been holy who lived in America.
One follow-up on that. So at the turn of the century, as this takes so long into the 20th century to kind of get right, Americanism is condemned, pragmatism is condemned, the little modernism more generally in the church is condemned, and America is kind of associated with some of those values. I mean, there's a whole constellation of values that at the beginning of the 20th century have been condemned and people silenced. And so you think, well, how do you make saints in that context?
And modernism is, these are modern saints. They're making the case they're modern. It's a great.
Bill Portier from Dayton.
So this is a question about polarization. So at the end of the book, you talk about polarization as the context for saint making now. People want to put their brand on the church and say who's a real Catholic. Like if we could canonize Cardinal Burke, that would make a statement, and that's the kind of thing that people want to do. And this is really an empirical question that you can't really answer, but I can't answer either. But it's something that your book made me think about, and that is polarization primarily a European American phenomenon? I know that we have Ben Carson and Ted Cruz, but the numbers, as I'm familiar with them, it's basically white people that are polarized. I don't know, that just, and so the context for saint making, to the extent that it's shaped by polarization, is like a European American kind of thing.
Right. I think you're probably right on that. I'll just say that in terms of polarization, I've realized how important it is. I think I use the phrase the keynote of American Catholicism and it affects how when I teach Catholics in America, where I divide the halfway point where fall break falls. It used to be before fall break, I'd get to World War I, and then the second half of the semester, and now I get to Vatican II before before the break, because for the first half, the main questions in the American Catholic experience, the fault lines were over a debate over what it meant to be American, and how did Catholics negotiate that, and then since the 1960s, early 1960s, all the major fault lines over what it means to be Catholic, and I think ethnicity and race play into that. And I think it's just become a much more fruitful way to teach, and it's where the students are themselves. It's what they know. And so I think polarization looms. So it's marginalization for the first half and polarization for the second half in terms of the way Catholics relate to America. But I think you're right. I think it probably is.
Linda and then Christy.
Lenny Promashevsky, a teacher at Notre Dame. I was thinking of, well, first of all, I like the book because I told you that. And thank you for explaining the process, because I never understand before reading the book fully. But the thing that I was thinking about when you all were talking about, well, the sisters have decided we don't want to spend money on this. We need our mission. We need to fulfill our mission, and I think you're right. Your point is about permanency, and I wrote down naming this, which isn't a thing, but one of the things I've always thought whenever I was reading the sisters' material I've looked at for the 19th century is their real dislike of anything worldly. And I realized, in a weird way, getting someone to sainthood is a worldly enterprise. And I just wondered how, because you see sisters, 19th century sisters, working so hard to get Elizabeth Seton, right? And I don't think of those women as worldly in many ways. And yet there is something about the opposite of the self-abnegation that you do see 19th century sisters so clearly, when they work in cholera epidemics and nobody else. Well, when they do all those things that they did for no glory and no reward. And so I just wondered, how do you sort of deal with that whole worldliness problem? Emotionally as well as historically.
Yeah. Well, first of all, just on the money question, I think sisters say that. That's an easy thing to say. We don't want to spend the money. We don't, that's what they say publicly. It's actually not that much money usually, and a lot of them have the money, as Melanie they just don't talk about how much money they have. I think that's easy. It's much harder to say we don't want to engage with the institution. We don't want to become, and I think it's a symptom of Catholic sisters since Vatican II, emphasis on their prophetic. It's the prophetic role we play. We're defining ourselves against the institution. So for until Vatican II, Catholic sisters are embedded they're running the institutions. They're building institutions. And since then, their focus has been on the prophetic witness and defining themselves in some ways as apart from the institution. You can trace that. And so, yes, by proposing saints, that's an inherently ecclesial process, and we have to engage again and again with ecclesiastical representatives who are always men, who are always priests, at every level of the bureaucracy, even on the local, even right at the very local level, even at the diocese. So I think that is part of it. It's really hard to get them to say that on the record, and like that statement, in my heart of hearts, I don't believe in canonization. That's what that's fundamentally about. Because canonization is the institution saying a person's holy when I can define the holiness. So yeah, I think that's part of how I'm trying to think about gender and power relationships and as they have played out in the last couple decades, which ties into a range of issues. But I think there is something to the self-abnegation. I mean, I know I mentioned being a Brother Andre's canonization. I mean, the first canonization I was at, this was a man who was functionally illiterate, being the first person elevated to this honor in a teaching congregation, a congregation that prides itself on literacy, on education. I was at the canonization of Marianne Cope and Tekakwitha in 2012. I mean, there's just the biblical, he who humbles himself shall be exalted. There's just never a better embodiment of that. These people whose work has been invisible, deliberately, invisibility and obscurity as something to be sought after, being the star of the show, a banner unfurled from St. Peter's. And so to participate vicariously in that, I think was part of that for a lot of these sisters. We're seeing this sister recognized in a way we ourselves have not pursued. So yeah, it's a great way to look at it.
Christy.
Thank you. Christine Abner Warren, University of Iowa. Kathy, thank you so much for writing this book. It's phenomenal, as you've heard. I appreciate a lot of things about your book and your work, but what I really appreciate about this book in particular is how you attend to the many entanglements and intersectionalities of gender, ethnicity, politics, nationality. You're doing so much in this book, and I see this as a book of sort of unpacking the entanglements and intersectionalities. And I really see you picking off from your last book and taking up Kathy Breckes' charge in her introduction to American women religious histories, women in American religious histories revisiting the past. We need to get beyond as scholars, historians, ethnographers, sociologists, however we define ourselves in the humanities, social sciences, as just adding women and stirring. And you seem to, at least to me, to really be attending to this in the process of disentangling all the entanglements. And I wondered, we all want to make interventions when we write books, and I found myself wondering, so I wanted to ask you today, was one of the interventions that you wanted to make was attending to this sort of getting at women's history in a complicated way where women are among the many players. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about how this came to be for you in writing a women's history among all the many players, because I saw you doing this so well. So.
Thank you. Yeah, I think in Seton's cause, I just think the replication, this is still one of the factors that delayed her cause for so long was the division in our congregation into the Daughters of Charity and the Sisters of Charity, which I never understood. I mean, I taught about it for years, and I never really understood that. Mary Beth, maybe you did better and understand sisters. And I had no idea. I mean, it took me years to kind of figure that out. And then, and the split happened because of Archbishop John Hughes in New York, and it led to, as you can read about, that chart that Michael Skaggs thankfully developed about the Seton lineage. Remember all the conversations we had about that, Michael?
I think I have a version about 37.
But that is still a really painful topic for them, and in fact, I don't think there are any daughters or sisters here today, but I had a daughter of charity and a sister of charity read the manuscript. And that was a very hard thing because I had a line in there, it might still be in there, but I talk about Seton's posthumous entry into the Vincentian family because the union with the Daughters of Charity didn't happen until 30 years after her death. And the Daughter of Charity just went crazy. I mean, she took serious objection to that phrase. She said, no, she had always wanted to be a Vincentian. I mean, this is an argument we had this is something she said in 2018. And the Sisters of Charity, and they have worked really hard to overcome this fracture in the congregation that resulted because of Episcopal meddling in the 1840s that reverberated in the 1940s with more Episcopal meddling and is still really painful today, and they're trying to come to terms with it and reconcile it. And I think I managed to do it in the end with a lot of help to attend to that pain. I had in Chicago, there's talk of having the Sisters of Charity and or the Daughters of Charity and Cabrini's congregation co-sponsor a book talk, but even that is Cabrini and Seton. I don't know if they could do something together. Really, these are very real hurts, and so yes, I think and Sister Isabel Toohey, who you mentioned, I had one extant letter from Sister Isabel Toohey, one letter that was in French that Jane During, who's here today, translated for me. I figured out Italian, but French just became too much. And so how do I insert her as an actor, as someone who shaped Seton's afterlife as she was in the process of defining what her life meant as a leader in the church that didn't recognize her as a leader. I was reviewing a manuscript for somewhere, and it talked about a struggle of the Catholic Church to regard women as equals. And it was at a particularly low moment in writing the book, and I said, how about a struggle to define women as people who have a standing, who can represent themselves? So yeah, and another moment in this canon, this 1983 thing was, I was at a moment in writing the book where I had I remembered reading that women could only be represented by male proxy, but I couldn't remember where I had read it. So I thought it would be a lot quicker to go to a contact I had at the Vatican Archives who could write to someone at the Congregation for the Causes of the Saints and find. I said, could you just tell me the canon law number that it is, and so I don't have to go through this box of primary sources. And I had my colleague write in Italian so I could get the wording exactly right. And the response came back from this priest, not the American priest, but a priest who works at the Congregation for the Causes of the Saints. And it was still, I can still, the condescension. Certamente, certainly, no provision has existed or has ever existed of the sort where women could not represent. And in fact, I find women insist upon representing themselves. And he denied that such a provision had ever existed. This was in 2017. And so then I had to go back to my box of primary sources. I spent hours and hours, but I found it. And it was Canon 2101. So I trotted over to the law library, which is the only place on campus that had a copy of the Code of 1917 Canon Law in English. I now own one, if anyone wants to borrow it. But I scanned it and sent it and said, well, actually, here it is. Here's the clause. And to his credit, the guy at the Sacred Congregation, he wrote back and said, your little American friend used the wrong phrase. He had to save face, but he said, but I thank her for shining a little bit of light in the darkness,
And I think that was so telling. I mean, here's someone who works at the Vatican now, at the heart of the Vatican, and doesn't know that until 25 years ago, women literally could not represent themselves. So yes, I don't know if I did do such a good job of disentangling it. To me, it seems more entangled than ever, having finished the book. But I think that's part of it, and it stretches back, really far. And I think untangling those relationships of gender and power and sexuality too, which is something that is not present overtly in the book, but is there. I think that's the work of historians, that we have to untangle those relationships in the past, because they're certainly problematic in the present.
Natalie.
Natalie Sargent, Notre Dame. I want to follow up on your answer, Kathy, and on Scott's question, to ask what role translation played as you wrote the book. You mastered Italian, I know, and you worked with some Latin, but especially considering that the Vatican in the 19th century, even until now, really does not use and often does not understand English. Did that ever come up as something really important?
Learning, I can't overstate how important it was to learn Italian, and what I learned as a result of that. So I didn't realize, for example, that the importance of, I was thinking about Frances Cabrini as an immigrant, like everybody thought about her as an immigrant, and realizing that she wasn't an immigrant is the way it went. She was a missionary, and that hers was only the second congregation to get approval for the feminine form of missionarie, Susanna, you can correct my pronunciation, but that term didn't exist in Italian until 1880. And but she wanted that in the title of her congregation to do that. So realizing that was a moment of illumination. Another one was the mistranslation of her title. She was declared the patroness of immigrants in 1950, and that was always translated, including by a member of her congregation who was fluent in Italian, as patron of immigrants. That was the American exceptionalism hitting me. It matters that she came here, not that she left there, but from the perspective of the church. I think we should do away with immigration. Actually, the term, it should be migration, always. I think that's what I've tried to do. And in fact, that's how Pope Francis refers to her, as the patron of migrants. So I think that learning, I appreciated, and I'm sure there were a lot of nuances, extra nuances that I may have missed, but just the nuances I gained from that understanding. And it did give me a whole new appreciation for the people who were charged with translating the American stories literally into Italian, but also translating an American mentality for the benefit of an audience that had very little understanding of what it meant to be American. So who were those people? Who did that? Who did they enlist to do that? Everything had to be translated into Italian, and that took work, and that was done most often by priests in the congregation, a few women. I know Ella Eads was a really important figure at Propaganda Fide who's doing that. I didn't find any evidence of her involved in that, but I'm sure she was. I probably just eluded me. So I think that's a really important concept, literally and metaphorically. How do you translate this experience, and what gets lost in the process of doing that? Because it's what the Americans thought the Italians wanted to hear, even though they threw in a lot of their things about how American they were and that they were naturalized citizens and all that. So it's fascinating. I think something we haven't attended to enough in American Catholic history. I think because of the focus on what happened here was most important, and so it's part of what I talk about and what John and others have done, a return to what was happening at the Vatican. And again, I can hear Peter D'Agostino, loud and clear saying, to presume to write the American Catholic experience about the American Catholic experience without understanding what that experience looked like, what the view from Rome is wrong. He said that very emphatically in his book, and certainly in person.
And as a quick follow-up to that, I think it may be worth noting that some of the people that we as U.S. Catholic historians consider the great Americanizers, like John Ireland, didn't speak Italian.
Did he not speak Italian?
He wrote in French, but not Italian.
Okay. Yeah. And that, I thought the Redemptorists were going to be mad at me, but I just loved when I found that source where John Ireland was objecting to John Newman being a saint, because he was too He liked languages too much. He liked national parishes too much. So sure, he may be holy, but he's not someone we want to represent American holiness. I mean, that was great. I mean, because usually and they do this, the petitioners send out, can we get bishops to sign on to all and usually the bishops, if they don't want to support it, they just don't bother answering. But here's someone who actually answered and said, no, I'm actually not going to support it because he's not American enough for me. So I thought that was great. That was a fun archival find.
Yes.
Jean Petit, Hope College. I was struck with something Kevin said too when I was reading the book about how early on they were thinking, okay, we get an American saint and that will make Protestants think better of us. And I was trying to understand the logic of that. I thought particularly if they're going for a convert from Protestantism, that would be more threatening to Protestants. I mean, at the time, Catherine O'Donnell's book showed us, that was a huge struggle about that back earlier on. And so I was just wondering, and particularly then they move on and you get Cabrini, who is an immigrant, and they kind of embrace that immigrant church thing when they seem more sensitive about it earlier on. So that kind of role of non-Catholics in the United States I found kind of interesting in the shifts of how Catholics worry about that over time. I just wondered if you could say more about that.
Yeah, I mean, that surprised me. I mean, I found that Gibbon's entreaty to the Daughters of Charity to open her cause in 1882, I found that when I was researching New Women of the Old Faith, and I just thought, that's really weird. I don't know if what was he thinking? And I didn't know I'd write a whole book about what he was thinking at the time, but I did. But I think they were really onto something, and it's just remarkable. All the Protestants that attended Newman's beatification and Seton's beatification in 1963 and kind of confessed to their saint envy. We wish we had this. This was, we would have been a lot better off if we hadn't. That's not an official teaching, but some of them said that in the process of joining the celebration. And what it meant in 1963, in the middle of Vatican II. That was something that I didn't realize the importance of until fairly late in the process. These beatifications happened in the middle, smack dab in the middle of Vatican II, when all of these relationships were being renegotiated. But yeah, Catholics always believed, and with some evidence, that Protestants really cared and had a stake in who Catholics named as saints.
Catholics better if there was an American saint, or you feel less?
I think it's the connection between hagiography and historiography, because it's about marketing. So you have to make a case for someone being a holy person, you have to situate them in the context of their life and times, which involves doing historical work. John Gilmary Shea, the father of American Catholic history, was very, very invested in finding an American saint because the processes were very similar. He was trying to insert the North American martyr, they weren't called that then, but the Jesuit martyrs, into American history. And he was really mad that historians didn't pay more attention to them. Just he was also really mad that the Vatican didn't pay more attention to them. There's the same impulse. Their story needs to be better known, both in the local context and in the universal Catholic one. So yeah, I guess they convinced me, and that they were, gosh, they're right. Protestants did care about this. And I don't know if they overstayed. I mean, they couldn't have foreseen what happened. I mean, Catherine O'Donnell's book is wonderful, and those of you who were at the seminar last spring know that, and those of you that have read it. But she also had a hard time. I mean, the narrative, as we understood it in Seton's life, was that she got booted out of New York because, it was anti-Catholic, and she had to go to more favorable climates back down in Maryland, to be. Well, I mean, what Catherine found and showed very convincingly and very tactfully is that she had to leave New York because she was proselytizing like crazy. The Protestant parents would have been happy to send their kids to her school had she not tried to convert them every single second of every single day. She had become a Catholic. She had chosen Catholicism. She wanted the people she loved the most to be with her eternally. So therefore, she tried to get them, but that didn't sit very well. So it wasn't so much this anti-Catholicism free-floating in New York that pushed her out. It was what she did to antagonize. And this did not go over very well with the daughter. They don't like to hear about that version of Seton, but that actually is true. And even so, the part I write about the 30s, she just such an, everyone hated her in New York because she was a Catholic. She got booted out of her elite circles. No, she didn't. It was her fault. I mean, she brought that upon herself. So,
Jonathan?
So yeah.
Yeah, hi, Jonathan at Wheaton College. I'm thinking about heroes in the civic context, figures that over American history have been celebrated and their names put on buildings, and now a lot of those names are being taken off, right? John C. Calhoun's on a building at an Ivy League college, and he's a slaveholder, and we don't want his name on the building anymore, and let's replace it, right? This is happening in civic spaces, this is happening on college campuses. The moment in which he was celebrated, but his name of it is past, and now there's a different set of values. So I'm curious, kind of taking that sort of public conversation we're having as a nation, regret about who we have valorized because the moment has changed, the values have changed. Do you see, now that there's starting to be a history of successful American saints, do you see any worries that there might actually be some regret about who became a saint and maybe a wish for a take back or a decanonization process? Because now, and then 100 years hence, there are going to be 300 years of canonized people, and will there be regret about who is canonized and we will want to take their names off the building?
That's a great question, and very the confluence is Junipero Serra, whose name has been removed from Stanford's campus, buildings named after him on Stanford's campus, and there's talk of removing the statue in the Capitol. Take-backs on canonization. I mean, I have been surprised, particularly as I've traveled the last year in the wake of recent revelations in sex abuse. I've heard public calls for take-back of John Paul II's canonization because it all happened on his watch. And I've been surprised at how public people have been about saying that. I think, I think I'd be more, I want to bring back the 50-year requirement that John Paul II removed. He removed it, he shortened it from 5 years from death until the opening of a cause, although the Pope can waive that, even that. But I think the 50-year rule is good. If anything, this, the long hours I've spent in reviewing these canonization processes, I mean, they're pretty thorough. I mean, of the 12 already canonized saints, I don't know. I mean, I think a lot of them, it does catch a lot. I think in a cause like John Paul II's that's done so quickly, there was not time to fully appreciate the ramifications of the sex abuse crisis. And 50 years elapsed, there may have been, and he might not have been canonized. But it's a great question, and it's being felt all over Catholic dioceses as the names of bishops who are implicated in the sex abuse crisis are being scrubbed from buildings. And I think it's part of this history of American holiness that could be told. Who are the heroes, and the heroes of a particular age? And we're dealing with it at Notre Dame with Columbus, whose cause for canonization has been floated different times and will go nowhere, just like Newt Rockne's. Sorry, hate to tell you. But yeah, I think that's a wonderful way. Saint making is just a really elaborate way to name a hero in a particular space. So it's a great question.
So we're near the end of the hour. We might have time for one more question. Maybe I'll ask one concluding question. Anybody? Darren?
Curious where you're going next.
Yeah, I have a lot of ideas. I'm very interested in these questions of gender and power that became more foundational to the story than I think I realized. I thought I didn't want to write a book about women in Catholicism. I decided I didn't want to do that. I wanted to write something broader, and then it wound up being essentially a book about women in Catholicism. But I think that's a really important story to tell, and I think I'm thinking differently about, in the light of revelations about the sex abuse, I'm thinking about gender and power and how they have been entangled and how we tell the story differently. I think the heroes of the American Catholic story have in some ways been the Dohertys and the Spellmans and the people that built the institutions. I think I used to show these slides in Catholics in America, of the burnings in Kensington, the neighborhood of Kensington in 1844. In Philadelphia and the Bible riots, and then Doherty purchases a mansion in 1933, a 30,000 square foot mansion on the main line. And how did we get? I now think the answer of how we got from 1844, from burning anti-Catholic riots in 1844 to a mansion on City Line Avenue in 1930, is the story of accumulation of power in the church, but in the state as well. A total accumulation of power that had ramifications for the way the abuse crisis unfolded. And so a church that felt besieged so much for so much of American history and developed a defensive posture that when that defensive posture was no longer needed, they still behaved in the same way, so therefore resisted. So I think actually it's a retelling of the American Catholic experience, being more attentive to what these power relationships were like and how they intertwined with sexuality. So I'm still thinking about that. I think the story, Catholic Sisters after Vatican II, that's a story that's really central to it. I realized in writing this book, I really like writing about people that are dead, which was my first. A lot of people toward the end of the book are still alive, still have a stake in that, so that scares me a lot, but I think it is unfortunately where I'm headed. So.
Maybe a final question for the group. So 10 years from now, and maybe we'll go Kevin, Christine, Kathy, 10 years from now in a graduate seminar, Kathy's book is read. Graduate students are taught to destroy the book, right, first, no matter how great. But then what are they going to say is the deepest meaning of the book for them and for the field? What would you say, Kevin?
Wow. Well, I think the deepest meaning that they'll take if they're trained as good historians is how traditions and heroes are made and unmade and changed to fit the current contemporary time. I think they'll point out, maybe with greater cynicism than Professor Cummings does, where the money was and where the power was and how certain people were canonized because they had stronger advocates. So I think there'll be an investigation of the power relations there. Mm-hmm. But I think the sort of transforming narrative that Kathy spells out so beautifully is going to be the central component of the book. I mean, stories change as we need them to change.
Mm-hmm. Christine?
I like what you said, and I could get behind that. But I think it will be pointed to as a watershed in Catholic historiography for her handling of the role of women religious in canonization, and really making these folks historical actors in the very important process of deciding what holiness is. And there aren't many books like that out there, and I think it will be seen as a signal contribution to that burgeoning literature.
Yeah. Kathy?
Well, I like both of those things. That sounds good. I guess my hope would be, and I'm not going to be able to. I need to think more about that and engage with colleagues in thinking about this. But we've been asking at the Cushwa Center for a long time, and certainly every doctoral student that I've ever given a comprehensive examination to, what's going to replace the Americanization paradigm? We know the Americanization, the immigrant church no longer works to tell the American Catholic story. So what replaces it? And of course, we don't have an answer to that yet. And this book doesn't provide an answer, but I think it leads that. That's what I was trying to do in epilogue, to think about, okay, the people who have been the heroes tell one kind of story, and it's no longer adequate to capture the diversity of the Catholic story, which is an American story. And so I guess my hope would be that this is part, not alone, but part of a literature that started to think about the periodization that we've used conventionally, the Catholics becoming American. I hope they rip apart the subtitle. I hope they say, what was she thinking with that subtitle? And think about a new way to narrate the American Catholic experience.
Excellent. Reminder, next April 18th is Darren Dochuk Anointed with Oil with Melanie McAllister and Andrew Preston. Please join me in thanking our commentators and Kathy herself.